Before sleep takes you, imagine walking barefoot through a silent Mughal palace. The marble floor feels cool against your skin. You pass golden lamps flickering in long corridors, the air heavy with rose and sandalwood. Somewhere behind locked doors, a secret room waits. Inside are books no one was supposed to see. Manuals of love, painted with care, written with devotion, bound in silk. These were not stories of kings and wars. They were guides to the heart, the body, and the strange balance between the two. Tonight, you will step quietly into that room. You will meet the emperor who collected desire as if it were knowledge. You will see how passion shaped empires and how silence protected secrets for centuries. Stay until the end, and you may realize that even in the most powerful courts, love was the most dangerous kind of wisdom. You wake to the faint sound of quills scratching against parchment. The air smells of sandalwood and dust. It is late in the 16th century, in the imperial city of Fatehpur Sikri. The Mughal Emperor Akbar has just finished another long evening of debate with his court scholars. But tonight, the topic is not war or religion. It is love. Akbar, unlike many rulers of his age, believed that knowledge itself was sacred, even when it dealt with the body. His empire stretched across thousands of miles, covering many languages, faiths, and customs. From the deserts of Rajasthan to the gardens of Kashmir, he ruled over people who thought very differently about intimacy, marriage, and pleasure. He wanted to understand all of it. So, deep inside his royal library, Akbar began to gather what few dared to read aloud. Manuals of love, written in Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic. He ordered translations of ancient Indian works that discussed not only desire, but the moral, physical, and even spiritual balance between man and woman. Among them was a text few outside India had ever heard of before, the Kama Sutra. But for Akbar, the book was not a scandal. It was a study. He assigned trusted scholars, including the learned Hindu Brahmin translators of his Maktab Khana, the House of Translation, to carefully render these ancient works into Persian, the language of the Mughal court. The goal was not to entertain, but to educate. The emperor wanted to know how desire shaped society, and how rulers of the past had governed it. The Kama Sutra became only one part of a much larger collection, a library of manuscripts now lost to time. Court records suggest that these texts of love were kept separate from the main archive. They were bound in silk, illuminated with delicate gold leaf, and often labeled only by number to hide their true subjects. Imagine the scholars at work, older men in long robes, whispering lines of Sanskrit to one another as they tried to decide how to translate the word kama. Did it mean lust? Or could it mean something deeper, something tied to beauty and virtue? The debates lasted years. Akbar himself joined these discussions. In the evenings, after prayers and official duties, he would summon his court intellectuals and courtesans to speak about the nature of affection, duty, and passion. The court chronicler Abu el-Fazl recorded that Akbar believed human desire could not be ignored. If tamed, it made a person whole. If denied, it made a person cruel. But these sessions were not open to all. The doors to the emperor's private library were guarded by eunuchs, chosen for their loyalty and discretion. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil lamps and burning myrrh. Only a handful of men ever saw the forbidden shelves that contained these works of sensual philosophy. Even so, Akbar's court was no stranger to public fascination with the body. The Mughal elite viewed sensuality as an art. Painters created vivid miniatures showing lovers on terraces, or queens bathing in lotus-filled pools. The emperor's wives and concubines wore perfumes made from rose and ambergris, believed to heighten affection. Poets wrote verses that compared passion to divine union. It was not pornography, it was philosophy. To the Mughal mind, desire was not shameful. It was one of the forces that kept the world turning. Yet there were always those who disagreed. Some clerics whispered that Akbar's curiosity was dangerous, that he blurred the line between sacred and sinful. Others accused him of trying to replace religion with sensual science. Akbar paid them no mind. In 1582, he ordered the translation of several Sanskrit classics into Persian, including the Mahabharata, Ramayana, and various treatises on yoga, medicine, and love. The emperor's goal was to unite the knowledge of his diverse subjects into one imperial archive. To him, studying desire was part of understanding humanity. Outside the palace walls, however, rumors grew. Some said Akbar had hidden the Kama Sutra in a locked chamber beneath the library. Others claimed he had commissioned new illustrations for it, images so detailed that they could only be shown to the emperor himself. Whether these stories were true or not, they spread across the empire. By the end of Akbar's reign, courtiers began to imitate his curiosity. Nobles commissioned their own versions of love manuals, blending Indian sensual theory with Persian poetic style. One rare manuscript, now lost, was said to list 100 methods of affection approved by His Majesty. Another described the art of maintaining harmony between multiple wives, written not by a man but by a woman scholar in Akbar's harem. It was a time when intellectuals spoke of pleasure without shame. Still, not all was harmony. Outside Fatehpur Sikri, the religious scholars of Delhi and Lahore grew uneasy. They feared that the emperor's fascination with bodily knowledge would weaken the moral order. Letters of protest reached the court, accusing Akbar of promoting heresy. In response, he simply invited the scholars to debate him in person. Most declined. What they did not know was that Akbar's interest in desire had begun to take on a new form. In his final years, the emperor's attention turned inward. The discussions of love became less about the body and more about the soul. He began to ask whether passion itself could be a form of worship, if the longing between man and woman reflected a greater cosmic balance. This idea would later influence his descendants, shaping how they ruled, painted, and even loved. The manuscripts he collected became a silent inheritance, a guide not only to pleasure but to power. Yet much of what Akbar gathered is gone now. When later emperors moved the capital, many of these volumes disappeared, stolen or destroyed in wars. Some may still lie hidden in old palace basements or private collections. Others were burned during colonial raids. Still, fragments survive. A verse here, a miniature there, a whisper in the records of Persian poets. You might wonder how much was lost when those shelves turned to ash. What ideas about love and human connection vanished with them? And why did an emperor, who ruled millions, devote so much energy to understanding desire itself? You sit once more in the quiet of Akbar's library. The air feels different now. Outside, the sandstone corridors of Fatehpur Sikri echo with the soft steps of servants bringing ink, parchment, and sweet betel. Inside, the emperor's maktab khana hums with activity. This is no ordinary scriptorium. Here, men of every faith, Hindu, Muslim, Jain, even Jesuit, sit together, their heads bowed over ancient scrolls. Akbar watches them work. He has built this place not only to preserve knowledge but to fuse it, to let one civilization's secrets breathe in another's tongue. And among the many works they translate, philosophy, science, and scripture, there lies a category few dare to name aloud: the texts of Kama. The translators handle these volumes differently. They whisper, they glance at the door before writing. They debate quietly about words that have no equal in Persian. What is rithi? What is Shringara? Is it love, or beauty, or pleasure, or all at once? Each word is heavy with centuries of meaning. These men are scholars, but also witnesses. They sense they are creating something that should not exist, an Islamic empire preserving Hindu eritology. Among them is a man named Faizi, Akbar's poet laureate and chief translator. Faizi is a scholar of Persian and Arabic, but also curious about Sanskrit literature. He is known to the court as graceful and reserved, but his private writings show a fascination with beauty, both earthly and divine. Faizi leads the effort to translate Indian works of love. He insists that such knowledge is not sinful but sacred. To understand desire, he writes in one surviving note, is to understand creation itself. Akbar agrees. He gives Faizi the freedom to continue, even when conservative clerics protest. If God created passion, the emperor says, then it must serve a purpose. The translation process becomes a ritual of its own. Faizi and his team sit cross-legged on carpets, surrounded by lamps. A Hindu scholar reads the Sanskrit verse aloud. Faizi listens, eyes half closed, and then slowly dictates the Persian version to his scribe. They pause often to argue over metaphors. Should a woman's beauty be compared to a lotus or to a prayer lamp? Should desire be described as flame or fragrance? These debates last late into the night. Akbar often joins them, his presence both inspiring and unsettling. The emperor listens to discussions about foreplay, posture, and emotional harmony as if they were lessons in governance. And in a sense, they are. Akbar sees parallels between the balance of lovers and the balance of his empire. To rule India, he must understand its rhythms, the soft power of persuasion, the need for harmony between opposites. To him, the study of Kama is not indulgence but strategy. Faizi, meanwhile, sees poetry in it. He begins composing his own verses on love, cloaked in allegory. In one, he writes, "The candle and the moth are one, but the world calls their union sin." In these lines, you can feel the tension of their work, the meeting of faith and flesh, intellect and instinct. Beyond the walls of the library, the empire watches. Some nobles whisper that Akbar's translators are corrupting Islam. Others are intrigued. Courtiers begin ordering private copies of the newly translated texts. Artists secretly add sensual imagery to paintings meant for the emperor's albums. A new aesthetic takes shape in the Mughal court. Refined, erotic, yet restrained. The human body becomes a symbol of beauty, not sin. Even the architecture of Akbar's palaces seems to echo this philosophy. In Fatehpur Sikri, marble screens filter sunlight into soft patterns. Courtyards are shaped like lotus petals. The air itself feels intimate, designed for quiet reflection rather than spectacle. But not everyone sees it this way. The conservative scholars of the ulama grow restless. They accuse Akbar of promoting pagan ideas. They fear that these manuals of desire will corrupt the moral foundation of the empire. Their opposition reaches a breaking point in the year 1580, when several clerics stage a quiet rebellion. They issue a fatwa condemning Akbar's religious innovations and his interest in non-Islamic philosophy. The emperor responds calmly. He summons the most learned among them to his court for a public debate. The room fills with tension. The scholars quote the Quran. Akbar quotes logic. When they accuse him of reading indecent books, he smiles and says, "It is better to know the nature of temptation than to pretend it does not exist." The debate ends without punishment. The emperor wins not through force but through patience. His calm unnerves them more than anger ever could. Still, Akbar senses the unease in his court. He begins to move the more sensitive works deeper into the palace, storing them in what his record keepers call Khazana-e-Mahbub, the treasury of affection. Only a few people are allowed entry. In this secret chamber, love and learning mix freely. Persian scribes copy Sanskrit diagrams of the body. Hindu scholars read Arabic treatises on anatomy. Artists illustrate scenes of lovers in gardens, not for lust, but to explore beauty, symmetry, and grace. A visitor today might call it a laboratory of intimacy, but to Akbar it is a temple of understanding. Over time, these translations travel beyond the library. Poets borrow their imagery. Musicians adapt their verses into songs. Courtesans recite passages as lessons in charm and elegance. The language of desire enters the bloodstream of Mughal culture. And yet, none of these works survive intact. Many were destroyed when Akbar's successors, more pious and less curious, viewed them as heresy. Others were stolen during wars, sold to collectors, or hidden in archives under false titles. Only fragments remain, snippets of Persian prose describing the dance of union, the scent of longing, or the discipline of affection. But those fragments tell enough. They show that Akbar's India once embraced knowledge that modern minds would find daring. The empire's greatest ruler believed that the study of desire was not a distraction from wisdom, but its companion. Imagine sitting beside those translators as the oil lamps flicker. You can almost hear their quiet laughter as they wrestle with words too complex for one language. You can almost see the emperor's shadow leaning over the scrolls, reading by candlelight. Somewhere in that dim room, between scholarship and secrecy, history changed. But one question remains. If knowledge of desire was once considered wisdom, how did it later become taboo? You return once more to Fatehpur Sikri. The lamps burn lower now. The palace feels quieter. The emperor's great city, once alive with music and debate, has begun to fade into silence. It is the twilight of Akbar's reign. The Maktab Khana, where translators once argued over the language of desire, stands still. Its scrolls lie untouched, wrapped in silk, gathering the slow dust of neglect. Some of the scholars who once filled these rooms are gone. Others have turned cautious, aware that a new wind is blowing across the empire. That wind carries the voice of orthodoxy. In Delhi, Lahore, and Agra, clerics begin to reassert their influence. They preach of discipline, restraint, and repentance. They whisper that Akbar's curiosity has gone too far, that his obsession with books on pleasure and philosophy is an insult to faith. The emperor grows weary of their protests but does not relent. "Knowledge," he once said, "is like light. To fear it is to remain blind." Yet even Akbar cannot fight time. When he dies in 1605, the empire mourns, but something deeper shifts. His son, Prince Salim, soon to be Emperor Jahangir, takes the throne. Jahangir is not like his father. He loves art, beauty, and indulgence, but his mind lacks Akbar's philosophical balance. For him, pleasure is not inquiry. It is escape. The secret library still exists when Jahangir inherits the empire. It is guarded, as always, by eunuchs sworn to silence. Within its walls lie centuries of Indian and Persian wisdom about love, harmony, and the senses. Jahangir visits it only once. He orders several volumes brought to his private quarters, where he shares them with his wife, Nur Jahan. She reads them, amused, and later commissions her own poetic reflections on affection and grace. But slowly, the sacred purpose of the collection fades. The manuscripts become curiosities, decorations, or worse, temptations. Within 2 decades, the library's meaning changes. The scholars who once copied Sanskrit texts into Persian have died or retired. Their apprentices, fearing scandal, hide or destroy the more explicit volumes. Paintings of lovers are quietly repurposed, some figures repainted, faces blurred, inscriptions erased. The illustrated Kama Sutra Akbar once commissioned vanishes completely. No one knows where it went. Perhaps it was moved to Agra when the court shifted. Perhaps it was burned when clerics raided private collections under Aurangzeb's later rule. Or perhaps, as some travelers claimed, a few of its pages were smuggled out, hidden inside the bindings of religious commentaries, to survive the empire's storms. Whatever the truth, by the end of the 17th century, the Mughal world that once studied desire had turned away from it. Aurangzeb, Akbar's great-grandson, rose to power with a different vision. Stern, devout, and intolerant of his forefathers' liberal experiments, he viewed Akbar's intellectual pluralism as weakness. To him, pleasure was not a path to knowledge but a trap of the flesh. When Aurangzeb's inspectors entered the old libraries, they found the remnants of Akbar's Khazana-e-Mahbub. They confiscated several works and ordered their destruction. Some scribes managed to hide a few manuscripts, wrapping them in plain cloth and labeling them as medical treatises. But most were lost. The scholars who had once debated the philosophy of desire now kept silent. Painters who once illustrated lovers turned to depictions of flowers and birds. Poets buried sensual verses beneath layers of allegory. The empire of light dimmed, and yet not all was forgotten. In small ways, Akbar's dream of harmony endured. The refined aesthetics of the Mughal court, its perfumes, its poetry, its architecture, carried the subtle memory of that old philosophy. Even when words of love were censored, their rhythm survived in song and scent. Centuries later, when British officers arrived in India, they found traces of the old manuscripts in private collections. Some were scandalized, others were fascinated. They translated these works back into English, often stripping them of context and turning them into exotic curiosities. The Kama Sutra that Akbar once treated as philosophy became, in Victorian London, a forbidden novelty. Ironically, What the Mughals once preserved as sacred knowledge was now mocked as indecent entertainment. Still, the original spirit lingered in the shadows of history. The idea that knowledge of the body and soul were linked never completely died. It resurfaced quietly in art, in medicine, in poetry. Every empire that rose afterward borrowed fragments of that old Mughal view. That passion, when understood, could reveal the soul of civilization. You can still feel its echo if you walk through the ruins of Fatehpur Sikri. The city remains eerily preserved, as if time itself paused there. The red sandstone walls still carry whispers of the men and women who once debated love as seriously as war. The air, if you breathe it slowly, seems to remember. Stand before the Diwan-i-Khas, the hall of private audience, where Akbar once listened to his scholars. Imagine him there, hands folded, eyes calm, hearing Sanskrit verses about affection read aloud in Persian. Imagine the silence afterward, heavy but alive. It is easy to think of empires in terms of conquest, but Akbar's legacy was different. He conquered minds. He built a civilization that dared to see beauty as a kind of truth. And for a brief moment in human history, love itself was treated as knowledge worth protecting. Perhaps the real secret of those manuals was never in the drawings or descriptions, but in what they suggested, that even rulers and scholars, at the height of power, were searching for something simple and eternal. Connection. It is quiet again now. The lamps in the library have long gone out. But somewhere, in a forgotten archive or a dusty storeroom, one of those silk-bound books may still rest, waiting for someone curious enough to open it again. And if they do, they may find not sin, but a reflection of themselves, written in the calm ink of centuries past. The court of desire, Jahangir, Nur Jahan, and the politics of pleasure. The night in Agra smells of jasmine and smoke. The moon floats over the Yamuna River like polished silver. Behind the palace walls, a woman walks through the marble corridors with deliberate grace. Her name is Nur Jahan, and her presence alone bends the court to silence. Every sound softens when she moves. Every eye turns. She is not only the empress, but also the unseen hand that rules the empire beside Jahangir, the emperor known for his weakness for wine, opium, and beauty. But what few knew was that the couple's partnership was built not only on love, but on power. Their intimacy shaped the politics of a continent. Their palace became a place where seduction and strategy intertwined, where the arts of affection became tools of empire. Tonight, as the lamps flicker and the court prepares for another private gathering, you will enter that world. You will see how Nur Jahan rewrote what it meant to be a queen, how her control over the emperor's heart changed laws, economies, and dynasties, and how their court, once filled with laughter and poetry, slowly became a stage for desire and decline. Stay until the end. The deeper you go, the more you'll realize that even love, when mixed with power, becomes a dangerous form of politics. The year is 1611. Emperor Jahangir sits in the peacock throne room of Agra Fort. His eyes are heavy from wine, his mind drifting between poetry and memory. Around him, courtiers wait in silence, fearing his moods. Then she enters. Nur Jahan, born Mera Nissa, daughter of a Persian immigrant official, moves through the hall with calm confidence. She is not dressed like other women of the court. Her robe is simple, pale rose silk trimmed with pearls, her face uncovered. Her gaze meets the emperor's, steady and unflinching. Jahangir rises. He has seen many beautiful women, but none like her. She is 34, widowed, intelligent, and completely unafraid. Their marriage follows within months, and soon the empire begins to change in quiet, invisible ways. For centuries, Mughal women were kept behind screens. Their influence was indirect, whispered through servants or through sons. Nur Jahan breaks that silence. She begins by mastering what the court values most: elegance. She designs new clothing styles, perfumes, and jewelry. She dictates how noble women should appear in public paintings. She encourages painters to capture her face, not as ornament, but as authority. The emperor, enchanted, allows it. Soon, Nur Jahan's name appears on imperial coins beside Jahangir's. She begins issuing royal decrees, signing them herself. The courtiers start calling her Padshah Begum, the Lady Emperor. But this is not merely vanity. Nur Jahan understands that in a court like Jahangir's, desire is both weakness and weapon. The emperor is known for indulgence. He drinks heavily, smokes opium nightly, and surrounds himself with poets who praise his sensitivity. His moods swing like the river's current. Nur Jahan becomes his anchor. She studies his habits, the hours he prefers, the poets he listens to, the spices in his food. She replaces wine with herbal tonics, disguising medicine as pleasure. She filters his audience, deciding who may approach him and who may not. Through affection, she governs. In the evenings, they sit in private gardens behind Agra Fort, surrounded by musicians and dancers. Jahangir listens to her ideas about trade, taxes, and justice. She speaks softly but with precision. Slowly, her words begin to shape policy. Under her influence, widows receive pensions, orphan girls get dowries, and merchants are granted trade protections. She also expands the empire's textile and perfume industries, exporting goods to Persia and Central Asia. Her personal seal becomes a symbol of trust. But not everyone celebrates her power. The nobles whisper that the emperor has fallen under her spell. They say she mixes aphrodisiacs into his drinks, that her eyes can change his mind. Soldiers mock her father, calling him the father-in-law of fortune. Jealousy grows. Even within the royal family, resentment festers. Prince Khurram, Jahangir's ambitious son, later known as Shah Jahan, resents Nur Jahan's dominance. He suspects she plans to secure the throne for her own nephew, Shahryar. The court divides into factions. And yet, the emperor's affection remains unwavering. He writes in his memoir, Tuzak-i Jahangiri, "In all my life, I have not seen a woman of such excellence, understanding, and judgment." At night, when the palace is quiet, Jahangir and Nur Jahan retreat to their private chamber. The walls are lined with mirrors, reflecting 100 flickering flames. Between them lies not just love, but an empire. The discussions that happen in those rooms are lost to history, but their results are not. Imperial appointments change overnight. Enemies vanish from court. Alliances shift. Through desire, Nur Jahan governs a vast and restless empire. But the same intimacy that gave her power also makes her vulnerable. As Jahangir's health declines, his dependence on her deepens. Courtiers plot behind her back. Rebellions flare in distant provinces. Each night, she returns to his side, speaking softly, steadying his hands as he drinks. She knows that the empire's stability now depends on her control of him, and that every whisper in the palace corridors carries her name. Still, she does not waver. Even as enemies gather, Nur Jahan continues to rule through charm and intelligence. She sits in audiences disguised behind a thin curtain, issuing orders to generals. Her face becomes the symbol of authority in a world ruled by men. But every empire built on intimacy carries a quiet crack. The balance between affection and ambition is fragile. And as Nur Jahan's power grows, so does the resentment that surrounds her. The day is coming when the same desire that lifted her will be used to destroy her. The court will whisper. The emperor will weaken. The lovers who once ruled together will face betrayal from within their own walls. How does a woman who built her throne on love survive when love begins to fade? It is late afternoon in the Mughal court. The sun paints the marble walls of Agra Fort in soft gold. Inside the harem, the sound of silken slippers gliding over stone floors mixes with faint laughter and music. But behind the fragrance and calm, tension simmers. Nur Jahan sits at a carved sandalwood desk, reviewing petitions. Her attendants stand silently by, holding trays of rolled documents sealed with wax. She reads each one with the care of a judge. A merchant seeking license to export indigo. A widow asking for protection from tax collectors. A noble family disputing inheritance. Her handwriting is neat, almost austere. Her tone, decisive. Every order she issues passes through the emperor's signature, but everyone knows the truth. Jahangir signs what Nur Jahan approves. Power has shifted, quietly but completely. Outside, The nobles murmur that the empire is now ruled by a woman's hand. Some are bitter, others are afraid. They have never seen a woman govern openly, and certainly not through affection. Nur Jahan knows this. She has built her rule not through armies but through understanding the rhythm of men's desires, their pride, their jealousy, their need for recognition. She gives each of them something to protect, and in doing so binds them to her. She promotes her relatives to high office. Her father, Idamadudidala, becomes the empire's chief treasurer. Her brother, Asaf Khan, oversees foreign trade. Her nephew, Sharyar, is given command of the army. The courtiers call it nepotism. She calls it survival, but her control is never absolute. Every evening, the emperor slips into moods no policy can calm. His health worsens. His dependence on opium deepens. He spends long hours staring at the moon, speaking of his youth, his regrets, and the ghosts of battles long gone. Nur Jahan does not weep or plead. She sits beside him, pouring wine into a crystal cup, replacing it with a weaker brew of herbs. She listens, nods, and then steers the conversation toward state matters. Tax reforms, border unrest, trade routes. Her presence becomes the empire's pulse. When she is calm, the court is calm. When she frowns, the ministers panic. This quiet authority spreads beyond the palace. Merchants begin naming perfumes after her. Jewelers craft ornaments in her style, light, elegant, restrained. In bazaars, women copy her dresses, calling them Nurjahani. But while her influence grows among the people, the nobles tighten their circle of resentment. Prince Khurram watches from afar. Ambitious and proud, he sees Nur Jahan as an obstacle between himself and the throne. He begins to gather allies among the generals, promising reform and discipline. In private letters, he accuses Nur Jahan of witchcraft, of using charm to cloud his father's mind. The accusation spreads quickly, whispered through corridors. At night, when the court gathers in the emperor's hall, eyes turn to Nur Jahan with a mix of admiration and unease. She remains poised, her smile unbroken. She has learned that silence disarms better than argument. Meanwhile, the empire strains under new rebellions. In Bengal and Kandahar, governors resist taxation. In the Deccan, local rulers test Mughal power. Jahangir, weary and distracted, relies more and more on Nur Jahan's counsel. She sends letters, organizes reinforcements, and negotiates peace, often without leaving her chambers. In one surviving document, written in her own hand, she instructs a governor, "Act with patience. A sword swung in haste cuts the hand that holds it." Her tone is that of a ruler, not a consort. Yet even her brilliance cannot stop decay from creeping in. The emperor's indulgence drains the treasury. Military discipline weakens. Corruption grows. And every success Nur Jahan achieves feeds a rumor that she seeks to place her nephew, Sharyar, on the throne after Jahangir's death. The rumor is not entirely false. Nur Jahan knows that when Jahangir dies, she will lose everything: power, protection, even her voice. The empire is not built for widowed queens. To survive, she must secure a ruler who will defend her. Her own stepson, Khurram, despises her. Her nephew, though inexperienced, is loyal. She begins to plan quietly. Letters sent at night, gifts offered to key generals, alliances built with care. The line between affection and ambition blurs again. But she miscalculates one thing: how deeply jealousy can poison loyalty. In 1622, Prince Khurram rises in rebellion. His army marches toward Agra, claiming to liberate the empire from corruption. Nur Jahan's forces meet him on the field. The war lasts months. Cities burn, trade halts, and through it all, Jahangir remains in the palace, pale and trembling, caught between his wife and his son. Nur Jahan visits him nightly, whispering reassurance. "It will end soon," she says. "You must rest." But her eyes betray exhaustion. She knows that every day of war drains their strength, that every messenger brings news of loss. When Khurram finally retreats, the court celebrates, but Nur Jahan does not smile. She knows he will return. His ambition burns too brightly to fade. Years later, her prediction comes true. In 1627, Jahangir dies on a journey back from Kashmir. The empire stops. His body is brought to Lahore, wrapped in white silk. Nur Jahan, now widowed, orders a mausoleum built in marble, the tomb of Jahangir still standing today. But her time is over. Prince Khurram, now Shah Jahan, seizes power. He strips Nur Jahan of titles, confiscates her lands, and confines her to a quiet house near Lahore. She spends her final years in silence, tending gardens, surrounded by a handful of servants. The woman who once ruled an empire through charm and intellect now lives as a forgotten widow. Yet she leaves behind something that no emperor can erase. Her vision of elegance becomes the Mughal aesthetic, refined, balanced, and deeply human. The jharokas she designed inspire later palaces. The perfumes she created continue for generations. Even Shah Jahan's Taj Mahal, built years later, carries traces of her influence in its floral carvings and restrained grace. Nur Jahan proved that power could wear silk and speak softly. She ruled not with armies, but with attention, patience, and understanding. And yet, her story ends as most stories of love and empire do, with loss. What survives is the memory of a woman who turned affection into governance, who blurred the lines between throne and heart. But perhaps the deeper question lingers still. Was her downfall caused by her ambition, or by a world that could not bear a woman who ruled without apology? The gardens of Lahore are quiet. A soft mist hangs over the marble tombs. Somewhere beyond the trees, a peacock cries, a sound both mournful and distant. Nur Jahan, now in her late 60s, walks slowly through the courtyard of her small estate. The world has forgotten her. Her husband is long gone. The empire she once guided belongs to her stepson, Shah Jahan, who tolerates her existence but forbids her return to court. The woman who once ruled the Mughal Empire through intellect and affection now lives alone, surrounded by silence. Each morning, she walks to a small pavilion overlooking a pond. Her servants leave food she barely touches. Her fingers, once covered in rings of gold, now hold a simple rosary. She spends her hours writing letters no one answers, tending flowers, and studying the play of light on the water. But memory never fades quietly. The scent of jasmine still reminds her of the palace corridors of Agra, of the nights she sat beside Jahangir as he listened to poets recite verses of longing. The sound of flutes from distant villages brings back the music of her youth, the soft rhythms that once filled the emperor's gardens. She closes her eyes and remembers the candlelight on his face, the warmth of his hand. For all the politics, the alliances, and the wars, their story had begun as something simple. Two lonely souls meeting in a court that never slept. Now, even their memory feels like a dream half erased by dawn. In the city beyond her walls, new monuments rise. Shah Jahan builds the Taj Mahal, a monument to love, marble white and flawless. Visitors whisper that it was inspired by Jahangir's tomb, the very one Nur Jahan designed years earlier. But her name is not mentioned. Her influence is buried beneath history's politeness. Still, traces of her remain in quiet corners of the empire. The coinage that once bore her name is still found in bazaars. The perfumes she blended are sold in small bottles, their formulas passed down by artisans. Some call them Itr-Nur, the essence of light. In the archives of Agra, old letters signed by her hand lie forgotten, firm, deliberate, precise. Historians centuries later will study them and realize something remarkable. That for nearly 15 years, a woman had ruled an empire larger than Europe, not through decree or fear, but through persuasion. But history rarely honors such power, prefers its queens tragic or invisible. Nur Jahan's decline is quiet, almost ceremonial. Her guards grow old. The ministers who once envied her die in comfort. The new court poets write verses of Shah Jahan's glory, pretending that her era never existed. And yet, among the people, her legend lingers. Merchants still tell stories of her fairness in trade. Widows remember her laws protecting their inheritance. Farmers speak of the year she reduced taxes during famine. Even courtesans whisper her name with reverence, calling her the woman who ruled without shame. One evening, as the sun sets over Lahore, Nur Jahan sits on the veranda, watching the last light reflect off the Yamuna's distant twin, the Ravi River. The call to prayer drifts through the air. She listens quietly. Her maid brings her a sealed wooden box. Inside lie the few objects she has kept: a lock of Jahangir's hair, a faded portrait of him, and a small emerald ring inscribed with his name. She touches them one last time, then closes the lid. No words are written. No farewell is recorded. She dies soon after, in 1645, buried beside her husband's tomb, in a simple grave she designed herself. No marble dome, no gilded calligraphy, only a modest inscription carved in Persian. If there is a paradise on earth, it is this. It is this. It is this. Centuries later, travelers will stand before that grave and wonder how a woman once so powerful could vanish into such silence. But her presence never truly left the Mughal world. Her style became its standard. Her politics became its pattern. Even Shah Jahan, who erased her name, followed her model of governance, mixing grandeur with grace, authority with artistry. You can still feel her influence in every Mughal garden, where symmetry meets softness, where marble meets water, where strength hides behind elegance. Nur Jahan's story is not one of conquest or defeat. It is the story of a woman who learned that love, when paired with intellect, could rule nations, but also that power, once shared with desire, is always fragile. When you walk through the ruins of her gardens today, you can almost hear the echo of her footsteps on marble, calm and certain. You can almost see her turning, one last time, toward the fading horizon. History may remember her as Jahangir's wife, but in truth, Jahangir was her shadow. And so ends the story of Nur Jahan, the empress who ruled from behind a veil of silk, and whose whispers once commanded an empire. Kama and power, translating the Kama Sutra for Mughal nobles. The night smells of ink and smoke. In the glow of oil lamps, a group of scholars sit cross-legged on thick carpets, surrounded by scrolls older than the empire itself. Outside, the desert wind hums softly against the sandstone walls of Fatehpur Sikri. Inside, history is being rewritten, not with swords but with words. You are watching the translation of the Kama Sutra, not as a book of pleasure, but as a political text. The Mughal court has decided that desire, like power, can be studied, categorized, and mastered. Every phrase carries risk. Every line could offend religion, yet enlighten a ruler. What begins as scholarship soon becomes something more. By translating the secrets of intimacy into Persian, these men are reshaping how an entire empire thinks about control of the body, the household, and the state. Stay until the end. The story of how the Kama Sutra entered the Mughal world is not one of indulgence, but of ambition disguised as philosophy. The year is 1583. Emperor Akbar has declared his dream of creating a new kind of knowledge, a universal library that would unite India's wisdom under one roof. The Maktab Khana, the house of translation, hums like a hive of restless thought. Scribes from Kashmir, poets from Persia, and Brahmin scholars from Varanasi gather here. Each day they copy, translate, and debate works on medicine, politics, and theology. But one morning, a small chest arrives from the south. Inside lies a palm leaf manuscript written in ancient Sanskrit. Its title is Kama Sutra of Vatsyayana. The room falls silent. To some, the name is scandalous. To others, it is sacred. It describes not just the art of union, but the duties of love, the rules of etiquette, and the ethics of pleasure. Akbar orders it translated into Persian. The task is given to Faizi, the same scholar who helped bring the Mahabharata into the Mughal tongue. Faizi accepts, though he knows the risk. A single careless word could draw outrage from clerics or laughter from nobles. Yet he also knows that the emperor's curiosity protects him. Akbar's instruction is clear. Translate it not for indulgence, but for understanding. So the work begins. The Sanskrit text, filled with metaphors of flowers and rivers, challenges even the most skilled linguists. Faizi must decide how to express intimacy in a language trained for politics and law. Words like rethi, comma, and Methuna carry meanings that Persian has never known. He experiments. He replaces direct terms with subtle imagery. Where Vatsyayana writes of union, Faizi writes of balance. Where the Sanskrit speaks of seduction, he writes of harmony. The result is not erotic poetry, but moral philosophy. Each night, he reads a portion to Akbar. The emperor listens in silence, his face calm, his mind working. If the body mirrors the soul, he says, then to understand one is to understand both. The translation attracts attention. Nobles gather outside the library, pretending indifference while sending servants to copy excerpts. Philosophers debate whether pleasure can coexist with piety. The conservative ulama grumble that the emperor has gone too far. Faizi presses on. He divides the text into 7 chapters: courtship, household duties, beauty, desire, restraint, the arts of women, and the union of opposites. He explains each section with Persian analogies, comparing love to governance, patience to justice, and the art of attraction to the art of ruling wisely. It becomes a manual for balance. Soon, copies begin to circulate among the nobility. They are not openly displayed but passed quietly between friends. Bound in soft leather, they are read by candlelight, hidden inside books of medicine or poetry. The Kama Sutra, once a spiritual text of India, becomes a mirror for Mughal ambition. Akbar uses its lessons beyond the bedchamber. He sees in it a method for ruling, a way to temper power with grace. He instructs his courtiers to study the section on Sambhoga, not as pleasure, but as metaphor. A king must learn, he says, how to win the loyalty of his subjects as one wins the heart of a lover, through patience, attention, and fairness. The idea spreads. Mughal governance begins to reflect the language of affection. Royal edicts start using words like soothing, nurturing, and harmony. Even court art changes. Painters create miniatures of lovers not as indulgent fantasies, but as symbols of unity. But not everyone approves. In Delhi, the scholars of the Darul Uloom denounce the translation as illicit curiosity. They warn that the emperor's tolerance will corrupt the empire. Their protests reach Akbar, who invites them to debate. When they accuse him of reading indecency, he replies, "If a ruler cannot study the nature of temptation, how will he protect his people from it?" The room falls silent. Faizi continues his work, yet he begins to feel uneasy. Translating desire into the language of power changes it. What once taught harmony now becomes a tool of control. One evening, while working on the final chapter, Faizi writes in the margin, "Love cannot be ruled, can only be understood." The next morning, that note is quietly erased by another scribe. The completed Persian Kama Sutra, renamed Nuska-e-Ishq, or the Treatise of Love, is presented to the emperor in a box lined with silk. Akbar reads it carefully, page by page, then orders it stored in his private library. He declares it a study of the human balance, and forbids public copies. But the courtiers have already begun whispering its phrases into poems, songs, and even letters. The empire's most private philosophy has escaped the emperor's control. Years later, the manuscript disappears. Some say it was destroyed by Aurangzeb's censors. Others believe a single copy survived, smuggled to Persia, where it inspired later works on ethics and affection. The truth remains uncertain, but the legacy endures in language, in art, in the quiet way Mughal culture learned to speak of love without shame. If knowledge of desire could teach emperors to rule with restraint, could it also remind them that control itself is a form of desire? The year is 1586. The empire stands strong, but beneath its polished calm, something new stirs. The Nuska-e-Ishq, the Persian translation of the Kama Sutra, is no longer just a book. It has become a quiet code for the Mughal elite, a mirror in which they see themselves reflected not as conquerors, but as connoisseurs of harmony, grace, and persuasion. You are in Agra now, where the scent of rosewater fills the halls. Courtiers sit in shaded pavilions, discussing philosophy with a strange mix of reverence and amusement. No one dares to say it aloud, but nearly every man of rank now owns a copy of Faizi's translation. It is not displayed on shelves. It is kept hidden, bound in red leather, tucked behind Quranic commentaries or volumes of poetry. But the nobles quote from it freely, disguised in polite language. The wise man must learn restraint in conquest. One courtier says, smiling, "For every battle won through patience brings more loyalty than 100 fought with swords." The others nod, pretending the quote comes from Aristotle or Ibn Sina. But everyone knows its true source, Vatsyana, the ancient sage of love. Slowly, the Kama Sutra becomes political. Ministers and governors use its metaphors to describe diplomacy. Every negotiation, they say, is a courtship. Approach too eagerly, and you are rejected. Wait too long, and the rival's heart grows cold. The line between bedroom philosophy and empire strategy begins to fade. Faizi, watching this transformation, grows uneasy. His translation was meant for study, not seduction. But in the Mughal court, ideas have lives of their own. What began as introspection now feeds ambition. Akbar notices this too. He warns his courtiers not to mistake pleasure for mastery. The man who believes he owns love, he says, owns nothing. Yet even he cannot resist the charm of the text. During evening gatherings, Akbar often requests readings from the Nusk-e-Ishq. His scholars take turns reciting verses about the qualities of ideal companionship, the virtues of patience, generosity, and silence. The emperor listens, thoughtful. "This," he says once, "is not a manual for indulgence. It is a lesson in restraint." But not everyone sees it that way. At the fringes of the empire, governors begin to use its lessons to justify excess. Feasts grow longer, palaces grow larger. Nobles compete to outdo one another in elegance and leisure. Pleasure becomes a marker of refinement, not sin. The Mughal court, once known for austerity, begins to transform. Painters depict lovers not in moments of passion, but of quiet companionship, hands touching over chessboards, eyes meeting across gardens. Architects design pavilions that encourage intimacy, small corners of beauty and shadow where speech softens. Even perfumes are reimagined, each scent crafted to evoke emotion rather than luxury. Desire, refined into art, becomes a language of class. But as the empire embraces this culture of refinement, its foundations begin to shift. The ulama grow restless. To them, Akbar's tolerance has gone too far. They see the emperor's philosophical debates with Hindus, Jains, and Jesuits as dangerous. They whisper that the Kama Sutra has infected the court with decadence. In sermons, clerics condemn the new arts of affection, calling them pagan remnants. They claim that Akbar's court is turning its back on God. The emperor responds not with anger, but with words. The path to virtue, he declares, is not through ignorance. It is through understanding. But understanding in this empire has become seductive. At night, musicians play verses from the Nusk-e-Ishq in courtyards lit by hundreds of small lamps. The lines are sung slowly, almost like prayers. Courtesans trained in poetry and philosophy quote Vatsyana as they pour wine. Scholars recite passages in secret, fascinated by the idea that pleasure could be an ethical pursuit. For a brief moment in Mughal history, love becomes a subject of governance. The emperor orders debates between philosophers and theologians to determine whether desire can lead to virtue. The Hindu scholars argue yes, it can refine empathy and discipline. The clerics argue no, it leads only to corruption. The debates stretch for days. No conclusion is reached. But the fact that such arguments exist at all shows how far the empire has drifted from convention. Faizi, tired and older now, watches in silence. He realizes his translation has achieved something he never intended. It has blurred the boundary between philosophy and pleasure, ethics and art. He writes in his private journal, "We translated a mirror and handed it to kings. They saw their faces, not their flaws." The next morning, that page too disappears. By the 1590s, the Nusk-e-Ishq has become an invisible foundation of Mughal culture. Its lessons are everywhere, though no one admits it. You can hear them in the emperor's policies of tolerance, see them in his palaces, feel them in the calm sensuality of court life. But the empire's stability begins to waver. Akbar's health declines. His heirs grow impatient. His generals crave conquest more than contemplation. And when new rulers rise, they will not share his balance between mind and body. What began as curiosity will soon become taboo. But before that silence falls, the Mughal world will see one last flowering of love, learning, and desire. Painters, poets, and philosophers will create works that blend beauty and wisdom in ways no empire ever has. For now, the lamps still burn. The manuscripts still whisper. The emperor still listens. And the question that began this translation remains unanswered. Can knowledge of love make a ruler wise, or does it only make him vulnerable to the very thing he seeks to master? The air over Fatehpur Sikri feels heavier now. The scent of rose and ink has faded, replaced by dust and memory. The Maktab Khana, once alive with debate, stands quiet. The manuscripts that once shimmered under lamplight are covered in cloth, their edges curling with age. Years have passed since Faizi first translated the Kama Sutra into Persian. The emperor who commissioned it, Akbar the Great, has grown old. His sight weakens. His hands tremble when he holds a pen. But his mind remains restless. He spends more time alone now in reflection. He still believes in what he built, an empire where reason and passion could coexist. But he knows that few will carry his vision forward. His son, Prince Salim, watches from a distance. Unlike his father, he has no interest in philosophy. He prefers wine, hunting, and the company of courtesans. To him, the Nuski-Ishq is not a guide to balance, but a book of indulgence. And so, the work begins to change meaning again. In the palace, nobles read the text not as moral study, but as amusement. Illustrators secretly copy its imagery, painters add gold and detail, and merchants sell versions in bazaars under false titles like the Book of Pleasure. What was once sacred becomes entertainment. Faizi sees it happening. He tries to intervene, writing a final commentary reminding readers that ishq, love, is discipline, not temptation. But by then, few listen. The empire has changed. The Mughal court now glitters with excess. Feasts stretch until dawn. Musicians play in halls perfumed with amber. Servants carry trays of mangoes and silver cups filled with chilled sherbet. The nobles wear robes so heavy with jewels that they must sit to move. Every gesture of luxury feels like proof of power. But in truth, the empire has begun to drift. Outside the palaces, famine and unrest grow. Local rulers rebel. The once unified faith of Akbar's Din-i-Ilahi dissolves. Clerics reassert control. They whisper that the emperor's tolerance has angered heaven, that his fascination with desire has weakened divine favor. When Akbar dies in 1605, the new age begins. His son, now Emperor Jahangir, inherits the throne, and with it, his father's hidden library. Among the books is the Nuski-Ishq, bound in leather, its gold script fading. Jahangir opens it once, glances at the ornate introduction, and closes it. This, he says, is my father's madness. He orders the manuscript sealed in the private archives. It will remain there for decades, unseen, as new emperors rise and fall. But even in silence, the book's influence lingers. Its language of balance and harmony becomes part of Mughal art, poetry, and architecture. When Shah Jahan builds the Taj Mahal, its symmetry reflects the same idea of unity that once filled Faizi's translation. When court poets write of love as devotion, they echo Vatsyana's vision of pleasure as discipline. Even Aurangzeb, the pious ruler who despises such texts, cannot erase the traces of the old philosophy. The refined restraint of Mughal aesthetics, its curves, its gardens, its quiet sensuality, owes its grace to that forgotten manuscript. Centuries later, British officers searching through old archives in Delhi stumble upon references to a Persian book of love. They never find the original, but they find enough fragments to suspect its existence. Some collectors even claim to own illustrated pages, miniatures of lovers beneath cypress trees, painted in soft tones. Whether these fragments are genuine or not, no one can prove. But what remains certain is that Akbar's experiment, the attempt to blend philosophy with desire, left an invisible mark on the empire's soul. It taught rulers to see pleasure as reflection, love as language, and art as order. It also carried a warning that few heard. Knowledge of desire, like power itself, can never be fully controlled. Once understood, it spreads quietly, shaping how people think, speak, and dream. If you walk today through the ruins of Fatehpur Sikri, you can still imagine it. The emperor seated cross-legged before his scholars, the sound of turning pages, the smell of ink and rosewater, the flicker of a single lamp lighting the faces of men who dared to translate the untranslatable. The Kama Sutra did not survive there as a text. It survived as an idea, the idea that understanding human nature, even its most private parts, is not sin but strength. That power without compassion is empty, and that even in the quiet corners of history, where love and intellect meet, empires are built not on conquest, but on curiosity. The secret scholars of sensual science in Fatehpur Sikri. The wind moves gently through the red sandstone corridors of Fatehpur Sikri. You hear the low hum of chanting, the faint scratching of quills, the occasional soft laughter of scholars lost in debate. Somewhere deep within this silent city lies a small room without windows, where the emperor's most trusted minds meet after midnight. They are not discussing war or trade or law. They are studying the hidden sciences of pleasure, anatomy, and emotion. They call it ilm nafsaniyat, the knowledge of the inner self. Here, men who studied medicine discuss touches therapy. Philosophers connect desire to the balance of the soul. Courtesans speak with scholars about the chemistry of affection. The conversations are forbidden, but they continue under Akbar's protection. Tonight, you will step into that chamber. You will hear how science, poetry, and philosophy once mixed in a quiet rebellion of thought. Stay until the end. The secret school of Fatehpur Sikri may be forgotten, but the questions it asked still echo. How does knowledge of pleasure shape power, and can understanding the body lead to peace of mind? It is the year 1588. The sun has set behind the great Buland Darwaza, the gate of magnificence, casting long shadows over Fatehpur Sikri. The city's fountains have gone still, the courtiers have retired, and the emperor's library has closed. Yet, deep in the southern wing of the palace, a door opens quietly. A handful of men and women enter by torchlight. They wear no royal robes, only simple garments. Among them are physicians, poets, philosophers, and dancers. Their leader, a man named Hakim Ali Jalani, carries a worn leather notebook. He is Akbar's personal physician and philosopher, a man of medicine who believes the health of the body cannot be separated from the harmony of the spirit. The emperor, fascinated by his ideas, has given him permission to form what he calls Majlis-i-Kafa, the hidden assembly. Its purpose is simple: to study the sciences of the self, including emotion, desire, and human connection. In the beginning, it is only a gathering of curiosity. But over time, it becomes something far greater, a secret academy of sensual science. The members meet once a week, often at midnight. They sit in a circle around a bronze oil lamp, each with a different discipline to share. The physician speaks of the body's humors, blood, bile, and phlegm, and how imbalance causes both illness and sorrow. The poet speaks of yearning and imagination. The dancer speaks of rhythm, breath, and gesture. Their language blends medicine, philosophy, and art. To them, desire is not sin. It is signal, a sign of imbalance or harmony. They study touch as communication, scent as medicine, and music as cure. They record their findings in coded Persian to avoid accusations of obscenity. Their notes refer to the warming of temperament, the softening of breath, and the stilling of restlessness. What they are truly exploring is intimacy. The hidden assembly believes that pleasure, when understood, can heal, discipline, and enlighten. That the same energy which causes lust, when purified, can lead to clarity. It is a radical thought. Outside their chamber, clerics preach restraint. Inside, they preach understanding. One night, a dancer named Ru Afsa presents a new idea. She claims that dance is the bridge between passion and peace. Her movements, she says, are not for beauty but for balance. She teaches the scholars how gestures mirror emotion. When the hand rises too sharply, she says, the heart burns with pride. When it falls too softly, the soul sinks in grief. Her insight fascinates Hakim Jilani. He begins writing a new treatise called Mizani Oru, the balance of body and spirit. The text, though now lost, was said to combine the precision of medicine with the rhythm of poetry. It described how pleasure, pain, and emotion share the same root in the human system, and how controlling one can heal the other. For Akbar, this new philosophy fits his broader vision. He sees knowledge not as division, but as union. He calls it Sully Kul, universal harmony. He quietly funds the hidden assembly, allowing them to import scrolls from Persia, Greece, and India. They study Galen's anatomy, Vatsyana's Kama Sutra, and Sufi texts on divine love. From these sources, they build a new science of desire. The emperor visits them occasionally, dressed in plain robes. He listens, never interrupting. Once, after a long session, he says, "You study the same truth I seek in governance, the balance between need and restraint." His words become their principle. For years, the hidden assembly thrives. Its findings influence art, medicine, and education. Court physicians begin prescribing not just herbs, but music and fragrance. Poets write of love as medicine. Even architecture shifts. Palaces are designed to calm the senses, to align symmetry with emotion. But nothing that challenges authority lasts forever. The ulama, angered by rumors of sensual science, begin to pressure the court. They accuse Hakim Jilani and his scholars of promoting heresy. They mix desire with religion, one cleric writes, and corrupt the emperor's judgment. Akbar defends them at first. "Let them speak," he says. "Knowledge cannot harm truth, but whispers grow." Spies report the late-night meetings. Courtiers warn that the assembly is mocking the faith. Hakim Jilani knows what must come. He gathers his students one last time. "We will disband," he says softly, "but our ideas will not." That night, they scatter their notes among trusted friends, hiding pages inside other books. Some in volumes of astronomy, others in poetry collections. A few survive, buried in archives, unrecognized for centuries. Others are lost to fire and time. When the scholars leave, the chamber is sealed. His oil lamp burns until dawn, then dies. Only silence remains. Yet, through that silence, something endures. The Mughal world begins to treat pleasure not as sin but as language, emotion not as weakness but as part of health. Courtesans become teachers of grace. Poets heal through verse, and musicians learn that every rhythm carries the pulse of the human heart. Fatehpur Sikri becomes a symbol of this quiet awakening, a city where reason and passion once shared the same breath. And even centuries later, when its palaces turn to dust, the question that began in that small hidden room still lingers. Can a civilization truly understand itself without understanding its desires? The sun has long set behind the sandstone arches. The city of Fatehpur Sikri sleeps, but inside a forgotten courtyard near the royal kitchens, a faint glow still flickers. A few surviving members of the hidden assembly gather again, this time in secret without imperial permission. It has been months since the emperor withdrew his public support. The clerics' accusations have made their work dangerous. Yet they continue. Hakim Ali Jilani now looks older, his beard streaked with white, his hands trembling as he grinds herbs in a stone mortar. Across from him sits Ru Afza, the dancer who first linked motion and emotion. A poet named Rahim joins them, and beside him, a calligrapher who disguises their writings as illuminated prayers. They speak quietly, each aware that spies may be listening outside the walls. "Desire," says Hakim Jilani, "is neither angelic nor sinful. It is like fire. It warms the home or burns it, depending on the hand that tends it." He opens a parchment covered in diagrams of the human body, drawn with careful lines. Instead of organs, the drawings show circles of energy, centers of warmth, breath, and rhythm. This, he continues, is how the body translates longing. Every touch, every glance, every song that moves the heart. These are forms of medicine. Ruafza nods. Then why do they call us heretics? Because, Jelani replies, we ask questions that priests cannot answer. The room falls silent. Outside, the wind moans through the cracks of the courtyard gate. Their work has changed since the disbanding of the official assembly. What was once theory has become practice. They now treat patients, not with herbs alone, but with words, scents, and sensations. A young woman enters the chamber. She is pale, trembling. Her husband, a merchant, explains that she has not spoken for months, that no physician has helped. Jelani gestures for silence. He asks Ruafza to play the tampra. The soft hum fills the air. Then, he burns a mixture of rose petals, cloves, and sandalwood. The scent spreads slowly, steadying the woman's breathing. Do not speak, he tells her gently. Just listen. Minutes pass. The woman begins to cry. Her tears fall without sound. Jelani places a hand on her wrist, measuring her pulse. The rhythm has returned, he says. She was not ill. She was unseen. Rahim, the poet, writes it down. Silence is a sickness cured by attention. This is what they call ilmi lazati sihat, the science of healing through pleasure. It is not indulgence. It is restoration. They believe that loneliness, restraint, and unexpressed affection weaken the body's balance. They teach that tenderness, spoken or physical, releases the same healing energy as medicine. To them, desire is communication, not corruption. In their secret writings, they categorize 7 forms of touch, each with a different purpose. To soothe, to awaken, to remember, to forgive, to encourage, to reassure, and to renew. They believe that when the emperor ordered the translation of the Kama Sutra, he was unknowingly reviving this ancient science, the understanding that the body and the soul are partners in health. For them, affection is not a distraction from faith. It is proof of divine balance. But their ideas spread quietly without credit. Courtesans adopt their methods, calling them nazakat isihat, the grace of healing. Wealthy women invite these whispering physicians into their homes, seeking cures for sleeplessness, grief, or heartbreak. Nobles send for Ruafza to perform her therapeutic dances, believing her movements restore calm to troubled minds. The work becomes dangerous. Clerics label them corrupters of morality. Some are imprisoned. A few vanish. Yet their philosophy seeps into Mughal life like fragrance in cloth. Hakim Jelani's disciples begin writing small scrolls summarizing their lessons in veiled language. Titles like Risala-e Nafas, the treatise on breath, or Tibizeni, mental medicine, appear in libraries across northern India. Each one hides deeper truths about touch, emotion, and longing. The scholars' focus shifts from pleasure itself to its power over pain. They find that emotional deprivation leads to real physical symptoms: fatigue, loss of appetite, trembling, headaches. They call it dil ki sukapan, the dryness of the heart. Their remedy is not drugs, but companionship, conversation, care, music, movement. In one preserved note, Jelani writes, "The heart, when ignored, becomes the source of every disease. Medicine heals the wound of flesh. Affection heals the wound of time." His theory will never be published under his name. Centuries later, fragments of his work will be mistaken for poetry. But within those verses lies a forgotten branch of medicine, the study of emotion as treatment. The emperor never formally closes the assembly. He simply stops mentioning it. But he quietly continues to apply its wisdom. Akbar begins to hold mahfils, small private gatherings with musicians, poets, and philosophers. He uses them to ease tensions between rival courtiers. The meetings begin with poetry, end with discussion, and often resolve political disputes without force. Even governance, in his mind, follows the same principle. Attention is healing. But time is running short. Hakim Jelani grows ill. He writes one last line in his notebook: "If man knew how to listen, he would no longer need medicine." He dies quietly a week later. The hidden assembly meets once more to honor him, burning incense and reading his poems aloud. Then, like all things too wise for their age, they fade into history. Yet their influence outlives them. Later Mughal physicians, poets, and teachers will borrow their concepts, often unknowingly. The idea that pleasure and balance shape health survives in Unani medicine, in Sufi literature, and even in modern psychology. Fatehpur Sikri remains silent now, but the ghosts of those nights seem to linger in its courtyards. You can almost hear the faint hum of the tampura, the measured breath of the scholar, the whisper of parchment turning. Their question still stands, unanswered across time. Can affection itself be medicine? And if so, why did humanity choose to forget it? Morning comes quietly over Fatehpur Sikri. The red walls glow in the first light. The city, once the heart of an empire, begins to empty. The emperor has moved his court back to Agra. The fountains dry. The birds nest in the marble carvings. Inside the deserted corridors, one locked door remains unopened. Behind it sits a single oil lamp, burning weakly beside a pile of manuscripts. These are the last writings of the hidden assembly, the scholars who once tried to unite medicine, art, and desire. No one knows they are here. The final years of the assembly are marked by silence and fear. After Hakim Jilani's death, his students try to preserve his ideas by hiding them in plain sight. They rewrite his notes as poems and metaphors, removing words like touch, passion, and pleasure, replacing them with light, wind, and balance. The language changes. The meaning survives. Rahim, the poet, becomes the last guardian of these teachings. Once a noble at Akbar's court, he now lives like a recluse in a small house near the old Fatehpur Mosque. Every evening, he copies a page from Jilani's Mizanijism Oru and buries it in the walls of the palace ruins. Paper burns, he says, but stone remembers. The empire above him continues to shine, at least on the surface. Jahangir, now emperor, loves beauty but not wisdom. His court is filled with painters, musicians, and storytellers. Yet no one remembers the science of harmony that once shaped their work. Where the hidden assembly saw knowledge as healing, Jahangir's court sees it as amusement. The philosophy of balance becomes decoration. The courtesans still dance, but no longer as teachers of grace. The poets still write, but their verses are hollow, built for applause. The doctors still prescribe herbs, but no one asks about the heart. The empire has forgotten that emotion itself can make or unmake health. One winter night, Rahim receives word that the emperor's inspectors will soon arrive to seize any unlawful manuscripts. The ulama now control the court's libraries. Their lists of forbidden works include treatises on astrology, music, and the human body. Rahim knows what will happen if they find Jilani's writings. He lights a small fire. One by one, he burns the original scrolls. The flames consume the ink, leaving only a faint scent of myrrh and smoke. But he keeps the summaries, his coded versions written in metaphor. He ties them together with a silk cord and places them inside a brass box. At dawn, he carries the box to the old Hiran Minar, the Tower of the Antelope, built by Akbar to honor a beloved pet. There, he hides it beneath the steps, covering it with stones. No record says what became of Rahim afterward. Some say he joined the army. Others say he fled to Persia. A few whisper that he stayed in Sikri, living among the ruins until the end. Centuries pass. The city falls into decay. Travelers write of strange inscriptions carved on old stones. Phrases about healing, longing, and breath. No one knows their source. The philosophy of the hidden assembly dissolves into fragments. Some of their teachings merge with Sufi mysticism, becoming parables about divine love. Others hide in Unani medical texts, reappearing as observations about emotional balance. A few travel through oral traditions, reaching far-off lands as folk wisdom. Phrases like "love heals all ailments," stripped of their origin but still true. By the time the British arrive in India, Fatehpur Sikri is a ghost city. The palace walls are cracked, the courtyard silent. Explorers wander through its ruins, sketching the arches and domes. One officer finds an old brass box near the Hiran Minar. Inside are brittle pages covered in faded Persian. He cannot read them, but he recognizes the beauty of the script. He sends the papers to Calcutta, where they are stored in a colonial archive labeled simply, Miscellaneous Oriental Notes, circa 16th century. No one opens them again, but the words remain, waiting, patient, unclaimed. If you visit Fatehpur Sikri today, you can still feel the pulse of that forgotten knowledge. The architecture carries its quiet rhythm, balance, proportion, symmetry. The same harmony that the hidden assembly once sought in the human body now exists in stone. Walk through the Panch Mahal's pillars, and you sense the layering of thought and breath. Stand before the Diwan-i-Khas, and you see the geometry of control and freedom. Every arch whispers the same message, that understanding the body and the soul were once the same pursuit. The hidden assembly failed not because they were wrong, but because they were early. Their world was not ready for the idea that sensuality and science could coexist, that healing could come from touch as well as tincture, from empathy as much as medicine. Their questions survived even as their names vanished. What if knowledge of desire had continued to evolve, not hidden in shame but studied with care? Would the world today still treat emotion as mystery, or would it finally understand that the need for affection is as vital as air? The last lamp in their chamber burns out. The flame fades, the smoke curls upward and disappears into the dawn. Only the silence of the city remains, carrying the memory of scholars who once believed that even the smallest kindness could heal the human heart. The emperor's tutors, when Persian poets wrote about pleasure. The court of Akbar was a school disguised as an empire. The emperor surrounded himself not with soldiers but with thinkers, men whose words carried more power than swords. Among them were poets, Persian masters of rhythm and restraint, who taught not through doctrine, but through verse. These poets were more than entertainers. They were tutors of thought, language, and emotion. They shaped how emperors loved, how they ruled, and how they understood beauty. They wrote of affection, moderation, and discipline, turning pleasure into a form of philosophy. You are about to step into their world, a quiet universe of calligraphy, candlelight, and cautious rebellion. Here, poems about gardens are codes for desire. Metaphors of wine conceal reflections on freedom, and every verse is a lesson for the emperor himself. Stay until the end. You'll see how Persian poetry turned Mughal rulers into students of emotion, and how even the simplest couplet could become a manual for mastering power. It is 1579. The royal court in Fatehpur Sikri glows under the pale light of hanging lamps. Scholars sit on carpets embroidered with gold thread, each with an inkpot beside them. The Emperor Akbar listens from his seat on a low cushion, his eyes fixed on a man reciting verses in Persian. The man's voice is calm, unhurried. His name is Hakim Faizi, brother to Abul Fazl, and one of the emperor's closest companions. His poems are not meant to please, they are meant to teach. He begins, "The heart is a lamp of divine flame, yet smoke rises when it burns too fast." The court murmurs approval. Akbar nods. The line sounds simple, but its meaning is deliberate. It speaks of restraint, of the danger of losing oneself in passion or anger. To Faizi, emotion is fire. It must be tended, not extinguished. Faizi and other Persian poets of Akbar's court are the emperor's informal tutors. They teach him not through sermons, but through subtle allegory. Their poems blend philosophy, mysticism, and sensuality, each word measured, each symbol deliberate. They draw from centuries of Persian thought, from poets like Hafez, Rumi, and Sadi, who wrote of love not as sin, but as revelation. When Faizi speaks of beauty, he is not describing women or wine. He is describing attention, the ability to see the divine in all things. In another poem, he recites, "When I look upon a rose, I do not see a petal but patience." Akbar listens intently. For him, poetry becomes scripture. The emperor often spends evenings in the company of these poets, listening as they debate the balance between body and soul. Some argue that beauty is a test, an illusion meant to distract man from God. Others insist that beauty itself is proof of divine presence. Akbar allows all sides to speak. If God is infinite, he says, Then his truth must include contradiction. The poets agree. In the Mughal court, verse becomes a kind of moral compass. Nobles memorize lines from Sadi's Gulistan as lessons in justice. Courtiers quote Rumi to justify mercy. Even soldiers whisper couplets before battle, believing that poetry grants clarity. But beneath the elegance, a quiet revolution unfolds. Persian poetry begins to reshape how the Mughals think about pleasure. What was once private becomes philosophical. What was once bodily becomes intellectual. The poets teach that the highest form of desire is not conquest, but appreciation. In their lessons, a glance becomes an act of reverence. A shared drink becomes communion. A lover's patience becomes proof of discipline. This redefinition of desire enters every layer of Mughal life. Painters illustrate their verses, creating images of lovers who never touch, their faces turned toward the horizon in silent longing. Musicians set poems to melody, turning restraint into sound. Architects carve poetry into marble, inscribing walls with verses about divine beauty. To Akbar, this new language of love is not indulgence. It is governance. He applies it to politics. When a rebellion breaks out in Bengal, he orders his generals not to crush it with force, but to win it with courtesy. When a rival noble refuses tribute, Akbar sends him a poem instead of an army. The message is clear. Persuasion is stronger than punishment. Poetry, Akbar tells his courtiers, is the language of patience. A ruler who cannot speak it cannot rule. The emperor's approach shocks the conservative clerics. They accuse him of mixing religion with romance. But Akbar sees no difference between devotion to God and appreciation of beauty. If words can soothe the heart, he replies, they can govern the world. His poets take this as a challenge. They begin composing new forms of verse designed to guide rulers. These are not love poems in the ordinary sense. They are manuals of conduct disguised as confessions. One poet writes, "The tyrant conquers the city. The wise man conquers the self." Another adds, "Every heart you wound becomes a throne you cannot sit upon." These verses spread across the empire. They appear in calligraphy scrolls, in the margins of letters, even on palace walls. Over time, they begin to shape Mughal culture itself. The line between poetry and policy fades completely. Under Akbar's rule, Persian poets become more than artists. They become advisors, physicians, and moral engineers. Their verses treat human behavior like medicine, prescribing humility, moderation, and understanding as cures for chaos. And slowly, their ideas move from language to life. Court etiquette changes. The tone of letters softens. Punishments grow rarer. Debates grow calmer. Even architecture reflects their influence. Arches curve gently, courtyards open wide to the sky, mirroring the openness that the poets teach in words. But with every age of wisdom comes a shadow. Not all emperors will treat poetry as philosophy. The same verses that teach restraint can be twisted into tools of flattery. The next generation will read them differently, less as guidance, more as performance. For now, though, the palace hums with quiet intelligence. Akbar leans back as Faizi finishes his final recitation for the night. He who rules with anger rules in darkness. He who rules with love rules forever. The emperor smiles. Then may we all learn to govern through affection. The poets bow, and the lamps dim. Outside, the night stretches over the empire, silent but alive, carrying the echoes of verses that would outlast kingdoms. The palace of Fatehpur Sikri glows beneath a pale moon. Inside its great halls, the emperor's poets sit cross-legged before low tables, their pages filled with ink and metaphor. The faint smell of musk and rose fills the air. Tonight, the emperor has asked them to speak on a forbidden theme, ishq, the word for love that Persian poets once used for both man and God. Faizi, always composed, begins with a verse. Between the lover and the beloved, there is no distance, only understanding mistaken for desire. The courtiers exchange cautious glances. They know these words are dangerous. To the devout, ishq belongs to God alone. To assign it to human affection is near heresy. But Akbar is intrigued. Continue, he says. Faizi explains that in Persian philosophy, love is a mirror. The attraction between two people reflects the connection between the human and the divine. Pleasure, when pursued with awareness, reveals discipline, not sin. Teaches empathy. The emperor listens. Another poet, named Abdul Rahim Khanikena, speaks next. He is known not only for his verse but for his sharp intelligence. Your Majesty, he says, a ruler must study love as he studies law, for both demand fairness, restraint, and understanding. He reads a verse from his notebook. When you see beauty, thank patience. When you feel anger, remember gentleness. To know desire is not to fall, it is to stand awake. The emperor smiles. This philosophy becomes the heart of Akbar's education. He learns from his poets that power and pleasure follow the same laws. Both are dangerous without humility. Over time, the emperor's evenings turn into seminars disguised as poetry readings. The poets read verses, and Akbar responds with questions that sound less like a ruler's commands and more like a student's curiosity. What is the purpose of beauty? He once asks. If it causes unrest? Faizi answers, to remind us that peace is not absence of desire, but mastery of it. From that night onward, Akbar begins to use beauty itself as a political tool. His palaces are designed to inspire calm. His gardens are arranged with balance to remind men of moderation. His poetry sessions become lessons in restraint. When nobles quarrel, he quotes a verse instead of issuing judgment. When generals fight for reward, he recites poetry about gratitude. Even his decrees begin to read like literature, short, rhythmic, persuasive. The poets of his court call this transformation adab-i-hukamat, the etiquette of rule. In Persian tradition, adab means more than manners. It means refinement of thought. It means controlling instinct through grace. Under Akbar, this principle becomes law. A courtier who speaks harshly loses favor. A man who responds with wit and calm earns promotion. Even military commanders begin quoting poetry in reports to the emperor, disguising strategic advice as moral reflection. One general writes, "The sword cuts clean when the hand is steady, but when the heart is unsteady, the blade turns blind." Akbar rewards him, saying, "You understand both war and poetry." Through language, the emperor disciplines his empire. But within this world of refinement, something shifts quietly. The line between wisdom and flattery begins to blur. Many poets, seeing how closely Akbar listens to verse, begin tailoring their work to please him. They fill their lines with praise, disguising obedience as philosophy. They call his reign divine, his mercy infinite, his rule eternal. The emperor, ever perceptive, senses this change. Poetry is meant to awaken, he tells Faizi, not to sing me to sleep. Faizi nods. Then, Majesty, perhaps you should hear those who dare to disagree. And so Akbar orders a contest. He summons poets from across the empire, Sufis, mystics, skeptics, even Hindus versed in Persian verse. Each must present a poem on the subject of ishq, not as praise, but as truth. The hall fills with tension. A young poet steps forward. He recites, "The emperor's love is the sun. It warms the world. But if it burns too long, even the flowers turn to ash." The room freezes. The line is dangerous, but brilliant. Akbar laughs softly. "You have understood both love and rule," he says. He rewards the poet with a robe of honor. That moment marks a turning point. The emperor's poets regain their courage. Their verses grow honest again, questioning power and reminding rulers that even affection must obey balance. Over time, these lessons evolve into a political philosophy, the idea that leadership requires mohabbat-i-adil, compassionate love. A ruler must desire justice as a lover desires union, patiently, selflessly, with constant awareness. Poetry, once dismissed as luxury, becomes the foundation of ethics. The Mughal Empire's culture of empathy, its architecture of harmony, its art of balance, all trace back to these teachings. The empire's greatness begins not on the battlefield, but in the lines of verse written under flickering lamps in the emperor's study. But history is never still. The poets who once taught emperors will later be silenced by them. The verses of love will be banned as decadence. The art of restraint will give way to greed and pride. Yet for one generation, in one golden city, poetry ruled the ruler. And in that age, every Persian couplet carried the same message: that true power lies not in command, but in comprehension. If words could teach emperors to govern their hearts, could they also teach the world to govern its violence? The years pass. The lamps that once burned through the nights of Fatehpur Sikri are now dim. Akbar's beard has turned white. His court, once alive with poets and philosophers, has grown quieter. The voices that once taught restraint and grace have begun to vanish, some to age, some to fear, and some to disillusionment. The emperor still listens to poetry, but the tone has changed. Gone are the verses of reflection and inquiry. In their place come flatterers, eager to repeat what Akbar already believes. They write not to challenge, but to comfort. They praise his tolerance, his wisdom, his glory. Their words are fine, but empty. Even Faizi, once the emperor's most honest voice, grows distant. He spends his days translating foreign texts, his nights writing verses that few will ever read. His final poems are short, stripped of ornament. When power learns poetry, the poet must learn silence. He dies quietly in 1595, leaving behind pages filled with riddles that scholars will spend centuries decoding. Akbar mourns him deeply. "He spoke less of me than for me," he says. That is rare. But the emperor's world is changing. The empire grows larger, and with it, the burdens of rule. Politics begins to outweigh philosophy. The debates that once filled his palace fade into reports of taxes, trade, and rebellion. The courtiers who once quoted Sadi now quote prophet. The poets who remain turn their words into decoration. Their verses adorn palace walls, coins, and carpets, but their purpose has shifted. What was once instruction is now display. The emperor's youngest courtiers do not remember the days when a single couplet could alter a ruler's heart. One evening, Akbar visits the old library. Dust coats the manuscripts. He opens a worn collection of poems written in his youth. The first page bears Faizi's handwriting. To rule is to listen is to love, and to love is to remember the smallness of the self. Akbar sits in silence for a long time. He realizes that the empire he built with patience and thought has begun to harden. The balance between art and authority, between beauty and power, is breaking. He closes the book and whispers, "Perhaps this, too, is the way of all things." Outside, the poets still perform, but the audience no longer listens with wonder. Their applause is routine. The connection between poetry and governance, the soul of his court, fades like smoke. When Akbar dies in 1605, the new Emperor Jahangir takes the throne. He loves art and indulgence, but not philosophy. Under him, Persian poetry becomes entertainment. The subtle lessons of Faizi and Rahim are replaced by songs of romance and praise. In a few short years, the empire forgets that poetry once taught its rulers how to think. The Persian masters, the emperor's tutors of discipline and desire, are remembered as artists, not as philosophers. Their influence survives only in fragments, in the soft rhythm of Mughal letters, in the courtesies of royal etiquette, in the measured speech of judges and diplomats. But their true legacy hides deeper. They had taught the Mughal world a rare idea, that emotion and ethics were one, that beauty, when studied, could train the mind to be just, that restraint was not weakness, but strength refined. That lesson, though nearly lost, shaped everything that followed. The balance of Mughal architecture, the symmetry of gardens, the tone of decrees, all carried traces of Persian poetic logic, harmony, proportion, and grace. Even centuries later, when colonial scholars examined the empire's ruins, they noticed the rhythm hidden in its stone. The Taj Mahal's verses, etched in marble, read less like prayer and more like Faizi's forgotten counsel. Gentle, balanced, precise. No one could see it then, but poetry had built the empire as much as war had. And yet, It ended as quietly as it began, with words fading into silence. You can still feel that silence in the ruins of Fatehpur Sikri. Sit there long enough, and the wind through the arches sounds almost like verse. Perhaps the poets never left at all. Perhaps their lessons still drift between the red walls, waiting for another ruler willing to listen, to learn, to love without pride. The empire moved on. The poets slept, but their message endures. To rule others, you must first rule yourself. To master power, you must first master affection. Forbidden women of the Zenana, voices behind the screens. The royal Zenana of the Mughal court was more than a chamber of silk and silence. Behind its carved screens lived hundreds of women. Queens, scholars, artists, and servants, each bound by the same rule, to be unseen. From the outside, the harem seemed like a cage. From within, it was a hidden kingdom. Letters passed through secret corridors. Poems were written on scraps of cloth. Some women sent political messages sealed with perfume instead of wax. Others plotted alliances, shaped royal decisions, and raised the next generation of rulers without ever stepping beyond a curtain. You are about to enter that unseen world, where voices whispered from behind veils could change the course of empires. Stay until the end. What you discover in the silence of the Zenana may change how you see history itself. It is dawn in Agra Fort. The marble halls glow faintly in the first light. The emperor's court has not yet awakened, but inside the Zenana, the women's quarters, life has already begun. You hear the rustle of silks, the clinking of bangles, the quiet laughter of attendants. The air smells of rosewater and incense. Hundreds of women live here. Mothers, wives, widows, dancers, scribes, and musicians. Each has her own story. Each carries power that cannot be seen. The Mughal harem was often described as a place of confinement, but that is only part of the truth. It was also a world of politics, art, and education. The emperor's women were not silent ornaments. Many could read and write Persian and Arabic. Some managed estates, commanded servants, and maintained vast networks of influence through letters. At the center of this hidden world stood a single woman, Hamida Banu Begum, the mother of Akbar. She was called Maryam Makani, one of pure lineage, but her power came not from title, rather from trust. She had guided her son through his early years of rule, advised him on alliances, and calmed his anger in moments of crisis. She lived simply, but her counsel reached every corner of the empire. It was through her that the emperor first learned the importance of listening. Each morning, women from different parts of the empire came to her for judgment. Some brought complaints against officials. Others sought help for families in distress. She heard them all, then passed her recommendations to Akbar. Her word carried weight equal to that of generals. This practice, women advising from behind screens, became a silent institution. The Zenana became both a school and a parliament. Educated women copied manuscripts and read aloud from Persian histories. Others composed poetry, often under pseudonyms, sending their verses into the court disguised as the work of men. In one account, a servant describes how a noblewoman named Gulrikh wrote a series of poems on loyalty and power. The emperor praised the unknown poet and ordered her work copied into the royal archive. Only years later did he learn that the poet lived inside his own harem. Inside the Zenana, love and politics were inseparable. Marriage was strategy. Affection could mean alliance. A gift of jewelry could seal peace between rival clans. And yet, within this world of influence, the women's lives were tightly controlled. They could not travel freely. They moved through the palace behind curtains carried by servants. When they spoke to men, it was through intermediaries. Even their letters were filtered through eunuchs who served as the empire's most trusted messengers. To outsiders, this life looked suffocating. But the women adapted. They built their own systems of power, subtle, invisible, and effective. They used storytelling, poetry, and music to express what they could not say openly. Every evening, the courtyards filled with the sound of song. Musicians played sarangi and sitar while the women recited poetry about separation and longing. But behind those verses were messages, complaints about injustice, satire against corruption, even coded criticism of imperial policies. One song became famous in whispers: "The moon shines for all, but the curtain hides it from the queen. Still, she teaches the stars to listen." It spread through the palace, repeated by servants and courtiers. Everyone knew it came from within the zenana, but no one dared to say who wrote it. In truth, the harem was the empire's mirror, its private conscience. When the emperor grew harsh, it was often a woman's letter that softened his decision. When generals plotted rebellion, it was often the women who first learned of it through whispers from their attendants. The zenana's information network stretched across the empire. Merchants, wet nurses, and musicians carried news in coded phrases. One might say, "The jasmine has wilted early this year," to mean a province had revolted. Another might say, "The river runs dry," meaning a governor had stopped paying tribute. In this hidden communication system, emotion became intelligence. Hamida Banu encouraged this practice. "A woman's silence," she said, "is often wiser than a man's speech." Her teachings inspired generations of Mughal women to rule through discretion. Even Akbar's wives, though rarely mentioned in chronicles, played key roles. Jodhabai, his Rajput queen, negotiated peace between Hindu nobles and the crown. Her letters, written in elegant Persian, spoke of harmony and coexistence. Another wife, Salima Sultan Begum, was a poet and political advisor who moderated disputes among ministers. Each worked through silence, influence, and subtlety. Over time, this unseen diplomacy became tradition. Mughal emperors learned to consult their mothers and wives before major decisions, not from obligation but from habit. The empire's public power belonged to men. Its emotional and moral intelligence came from women. Still, history would forget their names. Chroniclers called them the ladies of the harem, as if they were one body, one voice, one shadow. But behind the screens, hundreds of distinct minds worked in quiet unison, shaping the empire without being seen. If the emperor was the empire's face, the women of the zenana were its breath, unseen, constant, and vital. What history calls confinement might have been something else entirely: strategy and silence. Night falls over Agra Fort. The marble screens of the zenana glow softly from the lamps within. Outside, the courtiers discuss war and taxes. Inside, the women conduct a quieter kind of politics. The Mughal harem was not a prison, it was a labyrinth. Every corridor carried a message, every gift a purpose. From the outside, it seemed peaceful. From within, it was strategy in motion. The emperor's wives, mothers, and attendants understood what few men did. That power could move without footsteps. One such woman was Salima Sultan Begum, Akbar's aunt and one of his most trusted advisors. Learned in Persian and Arabic, she wrote essays on ethics and the art of statecraft. Her chamber was a classroom. Young women of the court came to her at dawn to learn to read, to debate poetry, and to discuss politics disguised as parables. She taught them patience first. "Never speak in anger," she told them. "Silence has more weight than speech when men believe you have none." Salima wrote letters on Akbar's behalf, carefully worded to sound like suggestions rather than commands. Governors and generals received them sealed with her private mark, a small rose drawn in ink. Every man who received such a letter understood its meaning. It came from the emperor's inner circle, the unseen authority. This was how women ruled from behind the veil. Their communication network stretched across hundreds of miles. Couriers carried their instructions in the folds of silk scarves or within jewelry boxes. The eunuchs who guarded the zenana were both protectors and messengers, loyal to the women who paid them well and trusted them completely. A single whispered message could change an imperial appointment. These exchanges were not limited to politics. They extended to matters of survival and affection. When famine struck in the north, Hamida Banu quietly organized grain distribution through her own servants. The decree came from Akbar's court, but the logistics were managed entirely from within the zenana. When Akbar's health failed, the women sent for physicians and scholars without waiting for permission. Their signatures appear nowhere in the records, but their choices saved lives. This hidden influence shaped the rhythm of empire. Every decision made in the public court passed first through the private one. The harem's discussions, opinions, and suggestions transmitted gently like perfume through air. Even love itself was political. Among Akbar's wives, the Rajput princess Jodhabai held special authority. Her marriage had united two powerful worlds, the Hindu kingdoms of Rajasthan and the Mughal crown. But her influence came not from her lineage, it came from her intellect. She introduced temple festivals into the court calendar, taught Akbar Sanskrit, and encouraged religious dialogues with Hindus and Jains. Through her, Akbar learned tolerance as philosophy, not policy. She once told him, "The empire cannot stand on swords alone. It must rest on understanding." That line would later echo in his policy of Sully-Kul, universal peace. The ideas that shaped empires often began as conversations behind screens, in voices too soft for history to record. The women of the Zenana used metaphors as weapons. When a noble defied the emperor, a wife might gift him a mirror, a gesture that meant, "See yourself before you speak again." When an enemy's loyalty was uncertain, a servant might deliver a half-wilted rose, meaning, "He fades in devotion." Language became code. Even art carried meaning. The women commissioned miniature paintings not for vanity but for communication. A painting of two doves meant reconciliation. A peacock with folded feathers symbolized silence before truth. The Zenana became a language school for the unspoken. This was not rebellion. It was adaptation. The Mughal court was a man's world, built on command and decree. The harem was a woman's world, built on influence and memory. Each needed the other to survive. Salima Sultan Begum once wrote, "When a man rules, he governs bodies. When a woman rules, she governs minds." Her letters show no bitterness, only precision. She knew her reach was invisible, and that invisibility was power. Even foreign visitors, Jesuit missionaries, Persian diplomats, and Turkish envoys recorded their surprise. They never saw the harem women, but they felt their authority. One Persian traveler wrote, "No man enters the women's court, yet no man leaves the empire untouched by it." Their restraint disguised control. When Akbar died and Jahangir rose to power, the Zenana's role only deepened. Nur Jahan, as you've seen before, ruled openly beside him. But even she learned her craft within the discipline of the harem, among women who shaped rulers before they met their thrones. The same letters, codes, and courtesies continued under her reign. The difference was that Nur Jahan made the hidden visible. Yet by then, the system had already changed the empire forever. The Mughal court had become more refined, its politics more patient, its diplomacy more psychological. Behind that transformation stood generations of women who never appeared in a portrait. The courtiers saw them as ornaments. The poets described them as mysteries. The truth is simpler, they were administrators cloaked in silk. The Zenana was not the empire's prison. It was its nervous system. The empire's orders might begin in the emperor's chamber, but its heartbeat came from here, from the quiet minds who ruled without being seen. When history forgot them, it also forgot the language of gentleness that once held the Mughal world together. If silence could shape policy, could empathy have built the foundation of empire more securely than conquest ever did? The empire changes. The red walls of Agra fade beneath new rulers, new wars, and new ambitions. The Zenana, the secret court of women, remains, but its heart begins to slow. Akbar's passing leaves a silence that no poetry can fill. His successors inherit his palaces, his titles, and his wealth, but not his balance. The women behind the screens sense it first. They can tell from the sound of the footsteps in the marble halls. The new Emperor Jahangir walks with impatience, not curiosity. His rule begins with indulgence. He brings music, wine, and luxury back to the forefront of the court. Yet even as he reclines in pleasure, the old system of invisible governance continues, at first in whispers, then in fragments. Nur Jahan enters that silence like a storm. Unlike the women before her, she refuses the veil of subtlety. She signs royal decrees in her own name. She holds audiences with ambassadors. She rides elephants through the streets of Lahore. For the first time in Mughal history, the Zanana's power becomes visible. What had once been diplomacy in shadows becomes command in daylight. Many women admire her courage. Others fear what it will bring. Salima Sultan Begum, now old, warns her gently, "Power that speaks aloud attracts the echo of envy." Nur Jahan smiles. "Then let the echo learn my name." For years, she rules beside Jahangir, perfecting the art that began within the harem. Subtle persuasion, gentle command, charm as authority. She uses beauty not as ornament but as strategy. She rewrites what it means to be seen. But her rise marks the end of the old order. The harmony of the Zanana depended on secrecy. When power becomes visible, it also becomes vulnerable. The nobles grow uneasy. The clerics grow hostile. They whisper that the empire is being ruled by a woman's will. Soon, the same system that once protected women begins to collapse. The communication network, letters, perfumes, symbols, still exists, but it now serves divided loyalties. Some women support Nur Jahan. Others serve rival princes. The unity that made the harem strong dissolves into quiet competition. After Jahangir's death, the structure that had guided emperors for decades shatters. The Zanana loses its influence. The new emperor, Shah Jahan, reveres women but limits their power. He builds monuments to love, the Taj Mahal, but walls away the living voices of women behind them. His wife, Mumtaz Mahal, becomes the eternal symbol of devotion. Yet in death, she silences a generation of living women. The empire begins to see them not as thinkers or mediators, but as ideals, beautiful, loyal, and silent. The Mughal Zanana turns from a council into a museum. By the time Aurangzeb takes the throne, the curtain between men and women becomes a wall. Scholars are banned from teaching women. Letters from the harem are censored. Eunuchs who once carried messages of diplomacy now carry only food and orders. The language of silk and scent, once fluent in politics, dies quietly, but traces remain. In old manuscripts hidden in palace archives, historians find poems signed only with initials, short, fierce, elegant. They describe longing not for love, but for liberty. Some lines read like prayers, others like confessions. One fragment says, "We wrote in whispers, and men called it silence. Yet our silence built their peace." No one knows who wrote it. Could have been Salima. It could have been Gulruk, or one of the countless unnamed scribes who kept the empire breathing from behind curtains. Today, the ruins of their world still stand: Agra Fort, Fatehpur Sikri, Lahore Fort. In the evening light, the marble screens cast patterns on the floor that look like woven words. You can almost imagine them whispering, the sound of unseen rulers shaping history in silence. They ruled without thrones. They taught without schools. They healed the empire's fractures with diplomacy hidden inside poetry and perfume. History erased their names, but not their influence. Every Mughal reform rooted in patience, every act of restraint, every balanced judgment carries their invisible touch. The Zanana was never only a place of beauty. It was an archive of intellect, emotion, and quiet defiance. Its fall was not the end of women's power. It was the moment it became unrecorded. As centuries passed, the voices of the Zanana dissolved into myth, turned into stories of lovers, wives, and ghosts. But if you walk through the marble corridors at dawn, when the air still smells faintly of rose and dust, you might sense what history forgot. That the most powerful empire in the East once learned how to listen to women it could not see, and their silence still speaks. The empire changes. The red walls of Agra fade beneath new rulers, new wars, and new ambitions. The Zanana, the secret court of women, remains, but its heart begins to slow. Akbar's passing leaves a silence that no poetry can fill. His successors inherit his palaces, his titles, and his wealth, but not his balance. The women behind the screens sense it first. They can tell from the sound of the footsteps in the marble halls. The new Emperor Jahangir walks with impatience, not curiosity. His rule begins with indulgence. He brings music, wine, and luxury back to the forefront of the court. Yet even as he reclines in pleasure, the old system of invisible governance continues, at first in whispers, then in fragments. Nur Jahan enters that silence like a storm. Unlike the women before her, she refuses the veil of subtlety. She signs royal decrees in her own name. She holds audiences with ambassadors. She rides elephants through the streets of Lahore. For the first time in Mughal history, the Zanana's power becomes visible. What had once been diplomacy in shadows becomes command in daylight. Many women admire her courage. Others fear what it will bring. Salima Sultan Begum, now old, warns her gently. Power that speaks aloud attracts the echo of envy. Nur Jahan smiles. Then let the echo learn my name. For years, she rules beside Jahangir, perfecting the art that began within the harem. Subtle persuasion, gentle command, charm as authority. She uses beauty not as ornament but as strategy. She rewrites what it means to be seen. But her rise marks the end of the old order. The harmony of the Zanana depended on secrecy. When power becomes visible, it also becomes vulnerable. The nobles grow uneasy. The clerics grow hostile. They whisper that the empire is being ruled by a woman's will. Soon, the same system that once protected women begins to collapse. The communication network, letters, perfumes, symbols, still exists, but it now serves divided loyalties. Some women support Nur Jahan. Others serve rival princes. The unity that made the harem strong dissolves into quiet competition. After Jahangir's death, the structure that had guided emperors for decades shatters. The Zanana loses its influence. The new emperor, Shah Jahan, reveres women but limits their power. He builds monuments to love, the Taj Mahal, but walls away the living voices of women behind them. His wife, Mumtaz Mahal, becomes the eternal symbol of devotion. Yet in death, she silences a generation of living women. The empire begins to see them not as thinkers or mediators, but as ideals, beautiful, loyal, and silent. The Mughal Zanana turns from a council into a museum. By the time Aurangzeb takes the throne, the curtain between men and women becomes a wall. Scholars are banned from teaching women. Letters from the harem are censored. Eunuchs who once carried messages of diplomacy now carry only food and orders. The language of silk and scent, once fluent in politics, dies quietly, but traces remain. In old manuscripts hidden in palace archives, historians find poems signed only with initials, short, fierce, elegant. They describe longing not for love, but for liberty. Some lines read like prayers, others like confessions. One fragment says, "We wrote in whispers, and men called it silence. Yet our silence built their peace. No one knows who wrote it. Could have been Salima. It could have been Gulruk, or one of the countless unnamed scribes who kept the empire breathing from behind curtains. Today, the ruins of their world still stand, Agra Fort, Fatehpur Sikri, Lahore Fort. In the evening light, the marble screens cast patterns on the floor that look like woven words. You can almost imagine them whispering, the sound of unseen rulers shaping history in silence. They ruled without thrones. They taught without schools. They healed the empire's fractures with diplomacy hidden inside poetry and perfume. History erased their names, but not their influence. Every Mughal reform rooted in patience, every act of restraint, every balanced judgment carries their invisible touch. The Zanana was never only a place of beauty. It was an archive of intellect, emotion, and quiet defiance. Its fall was not the end of women's power. It was the moment it became unrecorded. As centuries passed, the voices of the Zanana dissolved into myth, turned into stories of lovers, wives, and ghosts. But if you walk through the marble corridors at dawn, when the air still smells faintly of rose and dust, you might sense what history forgot. That the most powerful empire in the East once learned how to listen to women it could not see, and their silence still speaks. The empire changes. The red walls of Agra fade beneath new rulers, new wars, and new ambitions. The Zanana, the secret court of women, remains, but its heart begins to slow. Akbar's passing leaves a silence that no poetry can fill. His successors inherit his palaces, his titles, and his wealth, but not his balance. The women behind the screens sense it first. They can tell from the sound of the footsteps in the marble halls. The new Emperor Jahangir walks with impatience, not curiosity. His rule begins with indulgence. He brings music, wine, and luxury back to the forefront of the court. Yet even as he reclines in pleasure, the old system of invisible governance continues, at first in whispers, then in fragments. Nur Jahan enters that silence like a storm. Unlike the women before her, she refuses the veil of subtlety. She signs royal decrees in her own name. She holds audiences with ambassadors. She rides elephants through the streets of Lahore. For the first time in Mughal history, the Zanana's power becomes visible. What had once been diplomacy in shadows becomes command in daylight. Many women admire her courage. Others fear what it will bring. Salima Sultan Begum, now old, warns her gently. Power that speaks aloud attracts the echo of envy. Nur Jahan smiles. Then let the echo learn my name. For years, she rules beside Jahangir, perfecting the art that began within the harem. Subtle persuasion, gentle command, charm as authority. She uses beauty not as ornament but as strategy. She rewrites what it means to be seen. But her rise marks the end of the old order. The harmony of the Zanana depended on secrecy. When power becomes visible, it also becomes vulnerable. The nobles grow uneasy. The clerics grow hostile. They whisper that the empire is being ruled by a woman's will. Soon, the same system that once protected women begins to collapse. The communication network, letters, perfumes, symbols, still exists, but it now serves divided loyalties. Some women support Nur Jahan. Others serve rival princes. The unity that made the harem strong dissolves into quiet competition. After Jahangir's death, the structure that had guided emperors for decades shatters. The Zanana loses its influence. The new emperor, Shah Jahan, reveres women but limits their power. He builds monuments to love, the Taj Mahal, but walls away the living voices of women behind them. His wife, Mumtaz Mahal, becomes the eternal symbol of devotion. Yet in death, she silences a generation of living women. The empire begins to see them not as thinkers or mediators, but as ideals, beautiful, loyal, and silent. The Mughal Zanana turns from a council into a museum. By the time Aurangzeb takes the throne, the curtain between men and women becomes a wall. Scholars are banned from teaching women. Letters from the harem are censored. Eunuchs who once carried messages of diplomacy now carry only food and orders. The language of silk and scent, once fluent in politics, dies quietly, but traces remain. In old manuscripts hidden in palace archives, historians find poems signed only with initials, short, fierce, elegant. They describe longing not for love, but for liberty. Some lines read like prayers, others like confessions. One fragment says, "We wrote in whispers, and men called it silence. Yet our silence built their peace." No one knows who wrote it. Could have been Salima. It could have been Gulruk, or one of the countless unnamed scribes who kept the empire breathing from behind curtains. Today, the ruins of their world still stand: Agra Fort, Fatehpur Sikri, Lahore Fort. In the evening light, the marble screens cast patterns on the floor that look like woven words. You can almost imagine them whispering, the sound of unseen rulers shaping history in silence. They ruled without thrones. They taught without schools. They healed the empire's fractures with diplomacy hidden inside poetry and perfume. History erased their names, but not their influence. Every Mughal reform rooted in patience, every act of restraint, every balanced judgment carries their invisible touch. The Zanana was never only a place of beauty. It was an archive of intellect, emotion, and quiet defiance. Its fall was not the end of women's power. It was the moment it became unrecorded. As centuries passed, the voices of the Zanana dissolved into myth, turned into stories of lovers, wives, and ghosts. But if you walk through the marble corridors at dawn, when the air still smells faintly of rose and dust, you might sense what history forgot. That the most powerful empire in the East once learned how to listen to women it could not see, and their silence still speaks.